Hey everyone. There is a prominent question as to whether the UN choosing Palestinian land to form the Israeli safe haven is justified. In AD 70, the Romans defeated the Second Jewish Uprising and decimated the temple and the Jewish population. This led to the diaspora, the disbursement of Jews throughout Europe and the Middle East. Now, as a result of this, the region was home to Palestinians and other Arabs since the 1st century AD up until 1967. And that's almost 2,000 years. Therefore, by all standards, Palestinians were the indigenous people of the land and had every right to own it. Now, in 1967, the UN decided that Israelis needed a home country to prevent anything like the Holocaust from ever happening again. So, it chose the area we now know as modern-day Palestine. Palestine wasn't officially a state yet, so it wasn't part of the UN. Therefore, it wasn't part of any of the decision-making. But that being said, did the US at least acknowledge the people who were indigenous to the region? Well, no. And here's a picture of the 1967 borders as they were designed, right? You can see that the Israeli part is significantly larger than the West Bank and the other region that was provided for Palestinians to live in. So the UN basically came in and gave the land to the Israelis, and there wasn't really any justification for Israeli ownership of that land other than they'd owned it 2,000 years ago. It was the promised land, it was the land of the ancestors, blah, 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 right? Now, because of the injustice the people of Palestine have faced, we've had hostile groups like Hamas, the PIJ, and the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or something like that. And other groups whose goals have been to take back Palestinian land no matter what the cost, and they've used violence as a means, and we've condemned them for it. Now, as a result of this, Israel has had US backing since 1967. The US has sent money and weapons to the Israeli government, which has used it to suppress any possible Palestinian uprising. Israel has had unequivocal US support because, oh my God, aren't the Palestinians such savages who only know how to react to violence? But let's flip the roles for a second. Let's say the Israelis had settled the land for 2,000 years, and one day the UN came in, grabbed the land, and gave it to Palestine. How would the Israelis react? We all know the answer to that question. Now, as for the people who argue on Israel's behalf, they say that Israel is the most powerful country in the region, and if any other country had Israel's power, Israel would be obliterated by now, like especially Palestine. If Palestine had the military power that Israel had today, and Israel would be obliterated, right? Now, that's true. There's no doubt about that. But that argument is of no significance, because when you take into context the history of the region, the history of the situation, the Palestinians had lived there for 2,000 years and the Jews came and grabbed the land. When you have that context, it makes sense that the Palestinians are angry at the US, the UN, and the Israeli state. It makes perfect sense. Now, I'll use this analogy. During the African slave trade, the US government was more powerful than all African American slaves combined. about 10 million of them over the whole course of the slave trade. And if there was a single slave community that had the power of the US government, all white people would probably have died the next day. I mean, that's true. The slaves were obviously angry at white people, and they'll probably have killed them if they had the chance. But we don't bring up that argument because we realize how stupid it is. Because we understand the context. Now, the last thing we're going to say is that the Holocaust was a terrible, terrible thing. Everyone knows that. Every reasonable person agrees with that. And Jews have historically been the scapegoats of the world because they haven't had a place to call home for about 2,000 years. And there have been countless Jewish massacres since AD 70. So the UN deciding to create a powerful Israeli state was a reasonable thing to do. I completely agree with that. I mean, I disagree on where it should have been. I mean, since they were so eager to help out the Jewish people, land from one of the countries involved in making that decision would have been ideal. You know, call it Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Paris, and we wouldn't have the problems we do today. But instead, they chose Palestine because Palestine wasn't officially a state and had no power whatsoever against the UN. So they came in and drew up the borders, leaving Palestine with little or no land left, right? They did this, and the Zionist movement justified it because it's the promised land, they're historically entitled to this land, whatever, man. But overall, I think the creation of a powerful Israeli state was a necessary thing because of what had happened to the Jewish people in the past. The world had had enough of that. So we needed a powerful Israeli state. That being said, the oppression of the Jewish people we had seen the oppression of Jewish people. We had experienced this most recently in the Holocaust. It happened numerous times throughout history. So we decided that it was time to act. So we took a pretty drastic action. We created a state in the middle of another state. All right? So in the same spirit, now we see the oppression of the Palestinian people. If we act now, we can avoid having to take another drastic decision, like another drastic measure on behalf of the people of Palestine. And this is exactly how the BDS movement ties in. We need BDS, boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. Because the current Israeli state is oppressing the people of Palestine, and having BDS is the least we can do, right? If we oppose Hamas, the PLO, and the PIJ because they use violence, and rightfully so, violence should be off limits. These are terrorist groups, basically. So we oppose them because we use violence. And that's great, but we cannot at the same time be opposed to BDS, which takes the exact opposite approach. Knowing that it is nonviolent and that it works. Most importantly, it works. The UN imposed sanctions on South Africa during apartheid, and it worked. Not a single bullet was fired. Now, knowing that Palestinians are treated as second-class citizens in the state of Israel, and that more and more Palestinian land is being occupied by the Israelis every month. Now, military action directed against Israel would be perfectly justified because they are in direct violation of international law. They just ignore the borders and take up Palestinian land. Now, Netanyahu has been spoken to by the UN numerous times about this, and he shows no signs of wanting to do anything about it. So military action directed against Israel would be perfectly justified. And BDS will work as well. So pick your poison, you know? BDS, like it did that in South Africa, might also push the Israeli state in the right direction, like it did South Africa. So we can't be opposed to it. Thank you for watching. Have an awesome day.